Hello and welcome back to this downful idealistic crusade. Today I'll be talking about the fourth in the Avon publication series of novels based on the ghost who walks himself, the Phantom. These were done as a series of paperback novels in the 1970s by Avon Publications, hence why they're known as the Avon Phantom novels. They are all directly drawn from original stories by creator Lee Falk from the original newspaper comic strips, and some were actually written by Falk himself just as the first one does, that really retells the origin of the Phantom in novel form. Most of these were ghost written, but you can actually see who wrote the novels. Most of them were written by Frank Shawn, who wrote this volume as well as again most of the volumes. The series ran for 15 books and were definitely part of what was known as the men's adventure or men's pulp adventure paperbacks explosion that really happened in the 60s and 70s and carried on into the 80s, really manifesting most in long-running book series like the Destroyer or the Executioner novels. This is a very interesting thing, though, because you have a classic superhero comic character from the original pulp era getting a sort of relaunch in the sort of adventure novel form. But they are direct adaptations, so they are really like a novelization for a comic character, which I always find fascinating and really rewarding, because I prefer reading a novel to reading a comic, and every time I get invested in a comic character, I always wish there was a bit more in terms of descriptive prose and things. So I like reading books based on comic characters, even if they are just novelizations of pre-existing stories. This one is a really fun one. It seems like it would be a bit more straightforward because book 4 is entitled The Veiled Lady, and it deals with essentially the Phantom getting embroiled in what becomes a sort of Lost World type scenario. That's a very old trope in literature. Edgar Rice Burroughs pretty much made it a household name, along with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and many others. So the idea of having yet another story in a sort of lost section of the world that is full of prehistoric or strange exotic life forms, it's not exactly a new concept, and it has been done to death in both literature and films. So going into this, and especially looking at the very, very wonderfully pulpy cover by George Wilson, who did all of the covers for the Avon Phantom novels, you kind of know what you're getting into, or at least you think you do. What's really rewarding about this book, though, is that it's so darn enjoyable. And it moves at such a nice pace, as all of the Avon Phantoms do. And of course, they are based on almost entirely on the original newspaper strip stories, which had to be much more direct in their storytelling, simply because they're being told across an individual newspaper strip over a long period of time, and you have to be able to have your story encapsulated so anybody can pick up anywhere and just jump into the narrative. This one it's just so much fun, and I didn't expect that going in, because again, I've experienced so many Lost World type scenarios that, again, you hear, you realize you're going to be reading a story that's a sort of cliche that's done to death, and you're like, oh well, how's this going to work? Well, how the Veiled Lady works. And to talk about the plot just very briefly, the Veiled Lady refers to this famous volcano in the Bengala area, which of course is the home country of the Phantom, and the Deep Woods, which houses the Skull Cave, which is the Phantom's home base, essentially. And a visiting doctor on a research trip, the Dr. Jan Love, because all adventure stories have to have a beautiful heroine somewhere, has finally gotten the permission to go actually do an expedition of the Veiled Lady, because she wants to actually go down inside of it and explore for any potential strange life forms or bacteria, or she wants to essentially do a natural scientific study of what this sort of microcosm of life that has been cut off from the rest of the world inside this supposedly extinct volcano that's very treacherous. That's what she's come here to do, essentially. And of course, the volcano has a whole history surrounding it. Anyone who goes near it or tries to do anything with it usually winds up dead under mysterious circumstances. There are many legends of it, also perhaps containing rich mineral deposits such as gold or fabulous gems. And there's also a really very pulpy historical backstory of ancient peoples who lived around the volcano sort of revered it, and they would routinely commit human sacrifices by throwing people into the volcano. So there's a nice bit of bloodthirsty history behind it, if you will. So there's a wonderful story built up around this, and I love the actual title, the name they give the volcano, the Veiled Lady, because it's almost always veiled by clouds. It's a fantastic visual, and of course it gives the book a great title. So, of course, news breaks out of this expedition, and the sort of local criminal element decides they want in on the action, whether there is any action to be had. And, of course, this essentially means that when the doctor goes on her expedition, they fly a helicopter down into the volcano, and there's a really wonderful bit because they're communicating by radio with the Jungle Patrol, and there is no hint of what may be in this volcano except for the last radio broadcast, because, of course, something happens that we don't know, and all communication is lost with the expedition team. Because as the helicopter's going down, there's a sudden exclamation that's cut off as something happens to said helicopter. And then everybody has to sort of start to try to puzzle it out, including the criminal element that is wanting to exploit this expedition for riches. And so they essentially send a team of their own into said volcano to go after the expedition that they had already infiltrated. And in the midst of all this, the ghost who walks himself hears of what's going on, and as he pretty much knows everything that goes on on the entire continent, decides to intervene in his own right and goes into the volcano himself. What happens inside the volcano is, of course, where you run into the Lost World element of the story, which is actually a nice setup and surprise. But unfortunately, it's on the cover already, so you kind of know going in that this is going to be a sort of Lost World story. This is all classic pulp style adventure storytelling. So none of it is very shocking or very original in terms of it's something you haven't seen before. But it's put together in such a wonderful way, and the Phantom is able to do his phantoming in terms of the usual wonderful way the Phantom carries himself. It's an interesting predicament to find themselves in, because, of course, the lost world inside this volcano, due to some scientific mumbo-jumbo that Dr. Jan Love, again, great name, great pulpy name, starts spewing, is that essentially due to the atmosphere of the dormant volcano, because it's actually dormant, it was thought to be extinct, but it is dormant, has caused life to grow in different ways. And by grow, I mean literally grow, as the cover indicates. Essentially, they go into the volcano, and everything there is just at a grandiose size. Everything is massive. So, and that is for everything from flowers and jungle plants to insects are just massive, and of course any sort of what would be a normal sized creature is gargantuan sized. So this means even the slightest thing, like being bitten by a mosquito, is ramped up to an incredible degree, and then it becomes a sort of survival tale of how can not just the scientific research team, but the criminals now in the midst of this volcano, because of course they go in and the same thing happens to them and they get stranded too, and now you have the Phantom there as well. So you have these three individual groups inside this dormant volcano with all of this Lost World type feeling of everything being gigantic and having to struggle to survive and also not kill each other. And then they have to actually get out because, of course, it's a dormant volcano. What's a dormant volcano going to do in a pulpy story but eventually erupt? So it's a pretty good setup. It's a pretty pulpy setup in terms of it is a straight on Lost World type story. But again, it's done with such a wonderful pace and a wonderful energy. Everything in the story is believable. Everything in terms of the story constraints, obviously it's always going to be strange when you have people versus giant animals and things. But it's done with such good spirit that and everything is well laid out. It is a well crafted little story. It is a wonderful pulp adventure, and I was really struck at how many little moments that the Phantom was able to really display the core values of the character, and of course be a complete badass. So this is another one of these wonderful books where anybody can pick up and read it if they've never heard the Phantom before, and before the book's even a third over, you know exactly who this character is and why he's one of the greatest superhero characters of all time, and still persists in popular culture today, all the way from 1936. So I didn't think I would enjoy this book as much as I did, and honestly, it's one of the better and more enjoyable ones so far. Even though it is, it reeks kind of especially the sort of Lost World films of the 50s and 60s, or you can very much picture a film like The Lost Continent sort of when you're reading this, or when they made like Hammer's prehistoric films, or even The Lost World itself from Conan Doyle and the wonderful amazing silent film made out of it. So again, it's working with a classic sort of pulp story type, but it has such panache. It does it so well, and it builds to a rather nice climax where they do have to sort of battle their way out, and everything is fully believable, and they do get battered and bruised around, and they have to risk their lives in order to escape. So it's a very well set up little adventure. It does have an interesting subplot outside of the volcano, where you have the Jungle Patrol and police forces trying to deal with the criminal element and also figure out what happened to the scientist who disappeared. What's also interesting is the character of Dr. Love herself is not a damsel in distress, and very rewardingly is able to take care of herself. There's a whole little bit where when they get there, the local authorities don't want to allow them to go on further due to the extreme danger, and the fact that, of course, they don't want to admit it, but there is some sexism involved, because they're like, oh, well, you're a woman, you can't do it. So, of course, you get this wonderful bit where she is able to hoist them on their own petard, and she actually gets them to set up a bunch of targets, and then shows her expert marksmanship and her expertise in judo and the martial arts. So she is able to completely take care of herself. And of course, the things like that are always wonderful fun when you get them in a pulp adventure story, because you want a heroine of the story who has grit and has some two-fistedness and is able to take care of herself, because that's always better for a character than having the typical damsel in distress. So that's another nice touch of this. I really enjoyed this book. I really did. I thought it was going to be a bit more straightforward, and when I realized, it's a sort of Lost World type thing, and I'm like, well, I hope it'll be pretty good. It is. It's all of these books so far are not only immense fun and give you a great sense of the Phantom as a character. They are, of course, drawn from original materials written by Lee Falk, from the original strips, so they are based in the original materials. But they're, expanded a little bit. They are able to sort of, throw off the constraints a little bit, because you've got, 130 to 150 pages to play with. And again, these are very short, that you can read them very quickly. I read this one in one sitting, and it's also so well done and so enjoyable that you don't really want to put it down, because, you're already halfway through the book before you know it, and it's just so much fun. So I really enjoyed this one, and far more than I thought I would. So don't let the sort of, if you're not into Lost World type scenarios, this one is still immense fun. This is another of the Hermes Press reprints, so it's in this beautiful, slightly larger size paperback with really nice detail and printing. This is, of course, the original George Wilson cover, which is lovingly reprinted here. And of course, if you couldn't tell, this was a pure men's adventure paperback aesthetic they were going for. The covers, especially this one, really tells you. So right on the front, of course, we have a giant praying mantis and a giant bullfrog or toad, two of the creatures they do encounter in the story. And of course, Dr. Luff herself is in a moment of peril. And of course, this is targeted to a men's adventure crowd in the early 70s. So not only is she drawn like most pulp heroines on covers in a moment of distress, but of course her blouse is rather revealing. But all of these covers have wonderful detail like this, and they are, pure pulp adventure material. Particularly this goes along with all of the very attention grabbing extremely action-oriented and vivid covers of this, of really almost all paperbacks of the 60s and 70s especially. So I really do think the artists who are doing this work are vastly underrated, and this is just another of the wonderful covers that George Wilson did for this series. This is done like the others. They have these nice matching white spines. Very simple, but they look really nice on the shelf. And then on the back, as they do on this series, they reproduce the key artwork, but with a white background, so it matches very nicely. Again, this is a little bit bigger, obviously definitely bigger than the original paperback. Here is my only original printing of book 13, and as you can see, this is much bigger. So this is it's not full trade paperback for a graphic novel type size, but sort of in between that and a paperback, and it just feels really nice in the hand. The printing is really nice. The list price on these is $14.99, but honestly, they do really they do have nice value to them because they have a more premium quality feel. The printing is really nice. They're a little bit bigger. The text is nicely laid out. And the originals are not very common. You do have to pay quite a bit to get these, even on eBay. This was the only one I've ever found in a store, and even this was kind of beat up. So when I had the chance to finally look at these, I didn't know Hermes had reprinted them, and they had a sale on their website, so I just decided I was going to go ahead and get the reprints. And even at $14.99 each, these are wonderful adventures, and compared to what you're going to pay for an original copy in varying shape, this isn't such a bad deal, because if you are trying to get all originals, if you got the complete set, you're looking at anywhere between $100 and $200 or more in terms of eBay pricing right now, and of course condition will really vary, and these are wonderfully done. So if you're interested in these, I will have the link in the description below so you can look at them on Hermes' website. I do encourage you to order directly from them because it's always great to support the publisher whenever possible. And I'm just having a blast with these. These are really fun. This one is literally 127 pages, so it's a very quick read, but this will be something you'll want to come back to a whole lot of times, especially if you're a Phantom fan. These are really wonderful and so immensely fun. So those are my thoughts on Book 4 of the Avon Phantom novels, The Veiled Lady. I will continue in this series. I'm going along and reading one book at a time and just enjoying the heck out of these. It's really hard to be a Phantom fan here in the U.S. because outside of what Hermes is doing now with their reprints of the newspaper strips and volumes and things like the Avon reprints, it's only really sporadically you see the Phantom pop up, usually almost always in comics, and pretty much everything Phantom related is long out of print or only really available in other countries where the character is much more popular. And of course you have things like the Australian Phantom stories and the Swedish Phantom stories that are country exclusive. So and it's also unfortunately not as big of a character as he should be here in the U.S., and it's kind of ironic that he's still enormously popular in the rest of the world, but in his home country here in America is unfortunately sort of part of the forgotten realm of the classic pulp heroes, which without any of the classic pulp characters, you wouldn't have anything in terms of comic book superheroes or vigilantes or anything that people are still obsessed with today. And the Phantom is part of the core foundation of many of the ideals in comics, and it's great to get back to that, and I really do hope that more people discover the magic of the Ghost Who Walks, and these Avon books are a great way to do that, and that's why I wanted to talk about them one by one as I go along reading them, because they are just immensely fun. So as always, I hope this has been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you've ever read these or you're interested in checking out the reprints of the Avon Phantom novels, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And so happy phantoming, and thank you ever so much for watching.